So up next, we also have Alex. So Alex is also going to be sharing their presentation on autism, and this is yet another very personal presentation. So again, I applaud you guys who, like, as Yannick is saying, for sharing your personal experiences as well, and for feeling that this is rightfully a safe space to do so.
Yes, thank you. So as I'm starting here, I just want to let you all know that I have had experience presenting in a large group before. So autism spectrum disorder, I was diagnosed with autism in 3rd grade. So I was about 12 years old. And I have done a lot of work with people who have autism, as well as presenting to my class about what life is like with autism. This is my first time presenting about the neuroscience behind it. So we're just gonna see how this goes. So what is ASD, or autism spectrum disorder? It is a spectrum. It affects everybody differently, which is something that I really stress a lot in my work. It is very important that once you know somebody with autism, you don't know everything about people with autism. You know one person with autism and how it affects them. It is a multi-stage progressive brain developmental disorder. It spans all of prenatal and your young life. There's multiple different ways that there are theories about how it is formed, how it starts, but there's a large conclusion that it starts in the 1st, 2nd trimester, and the changes in the 1st, 2nd trimester affect the rest of your life. So the symptoms of autism, once again, it's a spectrum. It affects everybody differently. My symptoms are going to be different from anybody else's symptoms. You have very odd social communication skills. You have little or inconsistent eye contact, or only eye contact. And they talk at length about their obsession or special interest in a very unusual tone of voice. I have gone through a lot of work to get my voice to sound the way it does. I used to talk with a very robotic voice, and that is quite normal for people on the spectrum. And we struggle with perception, seeing things from different people's points of views. And as it says in the quote here, we struggle with idiomatic or melodramatic language. It's very difficult for us to understand metaphors, personification, because that's not what we see. That's not what we understand. There are a lot of people who have autism who struggle with restrictive or repetitive symptoms like echolokia, which is where they constantly repeat a single word or phrase, and that's one of their only ways of expressing themselves. Lasting intense interest and routine is very important for those of us who are on the spectrum. More or less sensitive to sensory input. For me, I am very sensitive to sensory input. If I am wearing a shirt that has a tag on it, that it's the only thing I can focus on for the entire day. If I hear things like the lights or the refrigerator, that's the only thing I can focus on. One of the reasons I wear headphones. We'll touch more on that later. But there are also people who don't feel the same, and they need that sensory input and they can't get it because they have less of the ability to feel things or hear things, taste things, things like that. There are a lot of benefits to having ASD. One of them is we're a lot faster at solving problems, and we're more likely to be educated in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, or math, than other college students, and 45% of people with ASD go on to have a post-secondary education. And there's not very much here that it's pretty much self-explanatory, but there are a lot of people who consider autism to be a disease or disorder or something that needs to be cured. And I know Sonia was talking about how if you were going to cure it, what would you do? I'm not going to cure autism. I don't want to cure autism. Autism is part of who I am. And if I cure autism, I lose my identity, or I lose part of my identity. There is nothing wrong with me having autism. I just see the world a little differently. I just feel the world a little differently. And although it does affect my family and it does affect people around me, in my mind, it doesn't affect them enough for it to need to be cured. There's a 1 in 54 children in America, at least, have ASD or are diagnosed with autism. And there's 3% of males are diagnosed with ASD versus 0.7% of females. One of the reasons for this is a lot of the symptoms are considered normal in young girls, as effects. If they were the same in young boys, it wouldn't be so. Right? If a boy is obsessed with like trains and that's the only thing he talks about, it's a little concerning, and people are a little bit more willing to say, you might want to change this. Whereas if a girl is obsessed with, say, a boy band, that's totally and completely normal. It's across, autism is prevalent across all races and religions, although it is found more diagnosed, at least, in people who have a slightly higher socioeconomic status or a little bit wealthier, just due to the presence of specialists and doctors that are actually able to diagnose autism. There are not many parts of autism that can lead to death, but 6.4% of people who have autism die around the age 39, and the leading cause of death is suicide. Because of so-called mild autism that is diagnosed, it allows us to be neurotypical passing. So people think we're normal. People don't understand the fact that we have autism and autism affects the way we function. Just because they see it, they think it's not there, which can be very stressful and can lead to things like suicide and the need to express themselves through self-harm because we're not able to express ourselves. I am able to express myself, and I've been told multiple times that I'm very articulate for somebody on the spectrum. About 40% of people who are on the spectrum never talk and never will. There are a lot of people who have it, and a lot of great minds who have it now. Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein, Temple Grandin, and Greta Thunberg are all people who are in the science fields. And one thing that I like to tell people who struggle to see that autism does have a benefit, if we didn't have autism, A, we wouldn't have a light bulb. Thomas Edison also had it. B, we wouldn't have any clue about time or space. And we might still be sitting in a cave somewhere. And we wouldn't have the great works of music that we still do today. Autism is something that can be a bit of a hurdle, but it is not something that needs to be a barrier. Autism affects multiple different brain regions, the neocortex, the amygdala, which functions in the social emotional aspect of all of this, the hippocampus, or the center, the striatum, and the cerebellum. Autism is present across all brain regions, and it affects things everywhere in the brain, but it is mostly in these 5 sections. There are multiple different cell types that have been associated or are considered high confidence ASD cells. And a majority of them are paleotropic, meaning they affect multiple different things. In this case, fetal processes, so proliferation, synapse development, so the development of different connections or bridges throughout the brain, and just the overall neural network development. There are a lot of different hotspots, is what they're called, in my brain. And I am able to do things like get out of bed, get dressed, and get ready quickly. But as soon as there's something different about the way I did it yesterday, it's an automatic stop. There are multiple different branches involved with studying autism and coming up with a cure for autism. The affective neuroscience, the behavioral neuroscience, working with people who do have autism and being able to help them function normally, because that's what society wants us to do. Clinical neuroscience, just the study of it, the cognitive neuroscience, the way that it affects our learning, and the developmental neuroscience, helping people who do struggle with the learning. There's a lot of things that are unknown about autism, and there are a lot of scary things that are unknown about autism. When does it begin? What are the causes? And how does it affect people who are older? Because autism didn't start being diagnosed until around the 80s, the only people and the only data points we have are people who are around 40. There are a couple cases, probably in the hundreds, about that are able to be studied that are older, but it's not enough to draw any conclusionary data.
Alex, I have a question then. So like you said that Mozart had it and Einstein had it, but you also said it wasn't being diagnosed until the 80s or something. So like, what drove the people to actually like state that Mozart had autism?
So they used post-mortem technology in order to work with their brains and saying we can see things in their brains that we don't see in other people of that time period. Also, a lot of historians have used recollections of their behaviors and their social engagements. It's known that there were a lot of these people were considered recluses, and they did not function in society. They did not work with different people, and we attribute that to their ADHD or autism. There is no scientific proof. There is no way to say that these people did in fact have autism, but it is accepted in the ASPE community that they did have autism, and we claim them as our own.
That's a really good, sorry for interrupting. That's a really good question, Yannick. That's a really good question and very good answer, Alex. And that's also what I was thinking for like Alzheimer's or other diseases where we only can look at plaques or tangles, or oftentimes the data that I get or that we all look at in bioinformatics, biostatistics and scientists are looking at is often post-mortem, so after they're dead. So the hope is that if we can look at maybe SNPs, identify mutations, and maybe one day with precision medicine, if we figure out which SNPs can give you or increase your likelihood of developing or having autism, or increase your likelihood of developing neurological conditions later in life, then maybe we can already start treatment plans earlier on, or, that's precision medicine that even without looking in the brain, we can probably take your DNA and look for certain SNPs and maybe come up with a predictive score that can predict the chances of you having certain conditions. And that's where we want to go with precision medicine. So very good answer, Alex. And thanks, Yannick, for asking.
Yeah. So there are a lot of high confidence ASD genes or HCASD genes. Specifically, the top three are the PEN10, the BRN2, and the CHAD8. There are a lot of similarities between the genes that affect autism and the genes that affect things like schizophrenia and ADHD, as we see in this Manhattan plot. There are also pathways in the brain that are affected by autism. The pathway that I have listed here is one that is most often seen. It affects the way that we transition from subject to subject, and the way that we are able to fluidly live our lives. And it also prenatally works with the cell cycle G1S. I do not know very much about cell cycle G1S, and while I was able to find research on it, I was not able to understand most of it. There are a lot of similar disorders to ASD. OCD is one that a lot of people say they have, when in reality they don't. And avoidant personality disorder, which is most often misdiagnosed as autism. Lead poisoning, while it is not a disorder, has very similar symptoms to ASD. The slower development times, the lack of social communication skills. And there's also a genetic disorder called 22q11.2, which is similar to Fragile X syndrome and to Down syndrome, and also has different symptoms of autism and Fragile X syndrome. People with Fragile X syndrome are more likely to have autism, which has led to a theory that autism is formed in the X chromosome of the father, if the patient is female, or of the patient themselves, which could contribute to the fact that there is a higher diagnostic rate in males. So there are a lot of correlations, but no known causes of ASD. If you have a sibling or a parent who is on the spectrum, you are more likely to be diagnosed, not only because your parents or parent may be more in tune with the symptoms of ASD, but also because it's the environment that you grew up in. And so if you're used to things being a certain way, those things can affect you in the future. If you have older parents, there's not a reason for this yet, but it has been found that people who have older parents are more likely to be autistic, and people with Down syndrome, Fragile X, and Rett syndrome as well, just because of the neural pathways that are affected in those diseases and disorders. And then the low birth weight. It's not something that is a cause of autism, but it is related to it in some way. We do know that the disruption of brain development in these different listed areas are all things that can cause autism and have caused autism. We don't know why they cause autism, but we do know that everybody with autism has these, or at least a couple of these different issues going on in the growth and production of their brain. So if any of you have any questions on that, let me know now, because this next part is going to be my story of autism.
I think you did really good job, Alex. Alex, do you mind if I just share my screen with you for just a second, guys? Yeah, I think you did a really great job. I want just to explain, because yeah, because I'm like, you did a great job in explaining autism, so a huge round of applause in having you explain it as well. You mentioned something that you didn't know, which is I'm thankful as well, because that was part of as well what I wanted you guys to tell me, is things that you don't understand, so that I may be able to explain those concepts to you as well. So what you were asking right now is that there are an autism spectrum disorder. What people are finding is that neural development disorder in autism may span prenatal and early postnatal
Sonia
life.
is explaining.
So I just
Sorry,
wanted
my
to,
sister's asking a question.
oh no, I just wanted to explain before you continue on. So what people are finding is that neural development, like before birth and when you're like just a few days, like, you know, the few weeks old, could begin with the dysregulation of cell cycle G1/S. And what Yale will talk about a little bit tomorrow might be that there's certain checks that happen in, you know, in cancer, for instance, that make sure when our cells divide, what happens is that they copy all of the DNA into the daughter cells and as well. So they have to duplicate their DNA, and then they have to like sort of pinch out, and it's a whole process of mitosis, of cell division. So this process, this cell cycle G1/S can be dysregulated, and there can be excess cell proliferation. Proliferation can be the spread. And then there can be disruptions in the synapses and neural circuitry that happens as well. So this cycle, this G1/S part in the cell cycle before we're born, can lead to this excess cell division and early brain overgrowth in these toddlers with autism spectrum disorder. So this is an induced pluripotent stem cells as well that people are finding. And basically what happens is, in a typical cell, you know, this is a growth phase. A typical cell is like in this resting phase as well, in the G1 phase. And there are certain markers as well. And this is where, when we have cancer, these checks are not really followed. And then in the S phase, this is the synthesis phase. So what we often observe is that the DNA starts replicating because the cell is getting ready to divide. And then in a G2 is it's a growth and preparation for mitosis with the cell division. Then it goes through cell division and it splits a cell, like it splits into two daughter cells. And then it goes back to resting as well. So what they're saying is that there must be issues in this part, the G1 and S phases of the cell. It's basically how, if we look up mitosis, and this, guys, you guys will learn way more about this in biology. I don't want to take away from that, but it's sort of how we go from, like, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, but just pretend that this is just like one pair of those chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. Then we have these copies being made here. And then what happens is that these are the spindle fibers that are pulling at it. So the DNA, each chromosome had to be duplicated. What Yale will talk about tomorrow a little bit is that if there are any issues in this process of duplicating, there can be mutations that are brought about sometimes, because this process isn't perfect. Even if I gave you guys the same routine task to do over and over again, I can guarantee you guys, and I can empathize with you guys, that you guys would probably slip up Like if you do the same task like hundreds of times, you can make mistakes. It's human error. That's why people promote programming as well, because computers don't make as many mistakes. The only difficulties are if you write your program wrong. Unfortunately, like a computer will only do, a program will do what you tell it to do. So people make mistakes. DNA can make mistakes as well. If there are mistakes that are made when you're copying DNA, that's sometimes where mutations come about. So sometimes, even though I said all the trillions of cells in the body have identical DNA, sometimes there can be mistakes, and not all cells have DNA. Maybe just a few vary a little bit because of mutations when they're copying the DNA. We have checks that try to check and make sure as the DNA is making a copy that there are no mistakes. Sometimes there can be mistakes, but usually with autism, this process of DNA replication that takes place, the checks are not really observed, and that's why there's a ton of growth in the G1 and S phases for autism. I just wanted to add that in just because you sort of mentioned that it's something that you weren't really sure about. So we have the G1S and G2 phases. And then mitosis has these four phases, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, that just really talk about how the cell divides. And there are various proteins. So I also hope you leave the class also learning that proteins do a lot of different functions. And this process in the cell cycle can be controlled by various proteins that can stimulate, like help lead to the cell cycle to cell division, or inhibit it. So too much inhibition is bad. Too much stimulation is also bad. We need everything to work in homeostasis and balance. So there are these CDKs that are one of the most important proteins that stimulate the cycle as well. So there are all these checkpoints present during the end of G1, start of G2, helping the vital processes of each stage get carried out. There's also an M phase. There are other processes as well. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about the cell cycle, but very good job, Alex, and I'll let you continue as well.
Yes, thank you. So my life with autism, like I said, I was diagnosed in 3rd grade, and up to that point, there were a majority of people in my life who tried to help me. There is a theory that my grandfather knew that I had autism, but he sadly passed before I was able to be diagnosed. How does autism affect me? I am highly routine. I have a very consistent bedtime, and I wake up at a very consistent time. And there's an order to everything I do. To the way I get dressed in the morning, to the way I get ready to go to bed, the way I eat my food, nothing can be touching. I pick apart my salads. It's considered rude in some cases, but it's just the way that I work. I need permission, quote unquote, to go places. If I haven't been somewhere before, or if I have been somewhere, but I've only been there with another person, I don't feel comfortable going back to that place unless either that person is with me or I have explicit reason to be in that area. And before I go to new places, I have to go through a situation and a scenario of this is what's going to happen, this is what it's going to look like, this is who's going to be there. And if I don't go through that, it becomes very, very difficult for me to function in that situation. I get dysregulated when I am around certain lights, especially fluorescent lights or lights that are in office buildings usually. They flicker, and a lot of people can't see that, but I can. And noises, those lights also make noises. But like I mentioned earlier, refrigerators, radiators, and touching, be it people or food, I very much struggle when I'm given something like a salad. I eat it one ingredient at a time. Smells bother me, which makes going to school kind of difficult because I don't know if any of you have noticed, but teenagers smell funny, especially in the locker room. So I handle that, but it takes a lot of work. And certain fabrics, wools, certain leathers, also they have a very interesting feel to them that my skin does not like. And a quote from one of my favorite authors, Rudy Simone, when we find something that fits, is comfortable, and is fashionable, it's like finding the Holy Grail. Because when it doesn't, it becomes very, very difficult for us to function. So in order to help me so that I don't have a total meltdown in public, which has happened before, I have to regulate. And the way that I regulate is I wear my headphones. It helps block out the noise. I can still hear, if we were face to face, I would still be able to hear what you're saying. I'd still be able to hear people in the hallway, but it just helps quiet some of the noises going on around me. I like to explain it to younger kids who ask me why I wear them. I basically got superhuman hearing. I hear things that you can't. I bounce on like an exercise ball. I'll spin in circles, and I use fidgets a lot. I know they were very popular a couple years ago, which caused for them to be banned in a lot of my schools, which made it very difficult for me. I either A, had to go through the day explaining to everybody why I had one and they couldn't, or B, just not use one. I ended up going with the first one. It did take a while. It was kind of difficult. I was like 13, and I was explaining to a bunch of kids who were older than me, which is an issue in and of itself, that I was able to have it and no, they could not have it. I also read and do math because those are rules. Numbers are rules. There's nothing in numbers that ever changes. There's an order. You do it the right way or it doesn't work. And weight, I have a weighted blanket that I'll wrap around myself. I will lift every once in a while, and I go for runs too, which helps a lot. Autism is very diverse. I've got autism, but I am a cisgender white girl. I also know that there are a lot of people on the spectrum who are diagnosed who are white, but it affects everybody. And I see it a lot in people who aren't diagnosed because they don't have the ability to be diagnosed. While I live in a pretty affluent area, I also go to school with people who don't. And I see symptoms in them every day. And a part of me wants to tell them that they have autism, but I can't because A, they don't have the resources to find it out by themselves and the ability to help treat it. And B, that's just not my place. It affects everybody. It affects teenagers, it affects adults, it affects toddlers. There's a common myth that autism stops. It doesn't, it never will, at least as far as we've seen. I know adults with autism who claim that it has gone away, but if you watch them, it hasn't. And they've just taken to doing things like drinking or gambling to help reduce that stress. And that's not something that's very good. And we need to form regulation habits early. These are just reference slides. My conclusion, autism is a disability. There's nothing about it that isn't. It affects us in ways that you will never be able to understand if you're neurotypical. No person displays the same symptoms, right? I know people with autism who like being poked. If you poke me, I will probably snap at you. There are people I know who are perfectly fine with wool blankets and like them because they're itchy, because they're rough. I hate them. There are a lot of people and things out there that are unknown. And we need to A, accept that, and B, realize that we can find answers, but those answers aren't going to be what we want to hear. And we need to accept that people with autism have a place in our society, and that people with autism aren't retarded or aren't simple, but are able to be in our community, and people need to change the way that they work so that we can function. The same way you would change, you would move around the layout of a workplace for somebody who's in a wheelchair. You need to be able to do the same thing for somebody who has autism. And that's the end. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask now.
Yeah, I think that was really, really well done, Alex. And I really appreciate you sharing that with me as well. Does anybody have any questions? And sharing that with everybody here.
So you talked about like hearing everyone from like the stuff we can't hear, you can hear. So does it feel like everyone's loud, or like you just can't focus on one person?
I think the easiest way for me to describe it is if you've ever been to a carnival or a fair and they have multiple different live musics bands going on, and they have multiple different flashing signs and rotating things, and you can hear the noises and the animals, and you smell all of the different smells. Imagine that, but all the time. You can't go home because home is the same way. Another way to describe it, if you've ever been for to a music festival, it's kind of like that. It can be very difficult. It's something that I need to work on a lot, being able to filter kind of, and not only filter what goes in, but what comes out. My filter doesn't work very well. And so if I'm unmedicated or if I'm tired, I say things that aren't considered socially appropriate. Even if I think they are, it's not politically correct. And it's not that I say things that are racist or sexist, but it's that I say things that are considered rude or potentially offensive to people. And it's taken a lot of work to get to where I am now. I still struggle when people interrupt me or when people use words or phrases that I'm not used to. I kind of shut down. And when I do shut down, you can tell, and it's very visible. I used to do this thing called airplane running. I think that's what I called it. I think it's like the Naruto run type thing. And that was very soothing for me. And I've seen a lot of other kids on the spectrum do it. But I also yell and I scream very loudly. And I have been described on multiple occasions as a dying goat. I take note of that and then do it to the person. It annoys them, but that's just the way that I handle it, and it's not exactly appropriate. But it works because they don't say it anymore. Because in doing that, you're making fun of my disability. Because, like I said, it is a disability. There have multiple people that have said to me, "Oh no, it's not a disability. You're just differently abled." No, I am not differently abled. I have the same abilities that you do. It just takes me a little bit while to get to those abilities. I also like to go off on tangents in case I can't tell.
Thanks so much, Alex. That the perspective is really, really nice. And I think that a lot of what I really want you guys to see from this is that we all are wired differently. One thing that in Ed's presentation as well, and that I also liked, and also what I liked in Alex's presentation, is that they're both very, very personal, and they show a lot of fact that there's a lot of diversity and what we all go through. And sometimes in these courses, what I hope that you guys take out of them is some of you guys, hopefully as many of you guys as possible will become could be healthcare professionals in the future, could be therapists, psychologists, social workers, direct healthcare people, researchers. And it's super important to continue having compassion, because a lot of times, I know I mentioned genome-wide association studies, and we have these mutations and we're trying to figure out what's going on. But so many times people are so interested in coming up with discoveries that they don't often think about, which is great, that there are ethical considerations that are also involved in, like, what if you could find genes that could predict if someone's depressed or not, or if you had precision medicine coming out with figuring out SNPs that can make you likely to have certain conditions. Like, could people use that knowledge for good or for bad? And many times, a lot of these conditions, some of them have manifestations that we can directly observe physically, like you're not able to walk, muscle atrophy, speech problems. Sometimes they can be things that we can't observe, and sometimes there can be stigmas associated with it, but there are a lot of neurological components. There are also things that are genetic and things that we can also do to help ourselves, like through therapy or through other ways that we can do to sort of circumvent the problems that we face. And I also hope that you kind of take with you the idea that we are still looking for a lot of treatments or better understanding for what's going on with a lot of these conditions, that we need to invest a lot more in science and research in these areas. So I hope that these things will motivate you guys. One thing I also wanted to say, just a huge round of applause again for you guys for going. Thank you, Alex, for being so so good at sharing. And as Alex Conrad has said, you're a great storyteller. I totally agree with that. And thank you. One thing for you guys,